So I want to look today at the social evolutionary narrative. This is the sort of meta story in which all civilizations and all peoples are put into one grand story of human social evolution. This is a story that doesn't necessarily begin with anthropology, but which anthropologists in the 19th century are going to refine into a formalized and quasi-scientific framework. But just to give you a sense of its earlier existence, here is a geography textbook from the early 19th century, Elements of Geography, Ancient and Modern. You have this little clip of the text here, and I'll give you a second to read over their description of how, quote, the human species may be considered as existing in the savage, the barbarous, the half-civilized, and the civilized state. So first, let's talk a little bit about where these words come from. Savages, barbarians, and civilized aren't inherently scientific names, and they're in fact names that are going to be borrowed in from a set of social prejudices. So savage ultimately dates back to the Latin salvaticus, from the woods, barbaros from an ancient Greek word, or barbarians from the ancient Greek word barbaros, indicating foreign and strange peoples, and civilized ultimately deriving from ideas about the town as opposed to the rural areas, right? So all of the ingrained ideas and preferences for civilized people or people from the city over people from foreign lands or from living in the woods or in other parts of nature are brought into these ideas about different peoples. In short, savagery, barbarism, and civilization are terms of abuse and pride that then are used to describe people in the present. And what anthropologists in the 19th century will do is take and formalize those ideas fairly uncritically to describe both the present and the past. So two early anthropologists and their work involved in doing this are Lewis Henry Morgan, who is an American anthropologist who writes Ancient Society in 1877, and Edward B. Tyler, a British anthropologist, the author of Primitive Culture, Researches into the Development of Mythology, Philosophy, Religion, Art, and Custom in 1871. And you'll notice that I'm using this red discredited banner in the upper left-hand corner really as a way of marking that one should not uncritically read any of these things as describing the actual past and actual story of how humans have developed over time and human culture has developed over time. But it is quite important because of the influence that these ideas have both on anthropology and also on public perception in general. So I'm going to look at Lewis Henry Morgan for a second in Ancient Society. Morgan lays out a method which is basically to imagine people in any culture as having like one great stack of achievements, ideas, inventions, ways of organizing their kinship and their families, ways of doing things, everything from fishing and hunting to masonry and construction and railroads, and imagines them as one big stack of things. Early in the introduction, Morgan lays out this idea that we can retrace, quote, the several lines of progress since the primitive ages of mankind and eliminate one after the other in the order in which they appeared, inventions and discoveries on the one hand and institutions on the other, right? So basically, a culture is an accumulation of institutions and ideas, and that people who live in civilized cultures are the ones who have accumulated the most of those things. And therefore, one can think of these earlier two stages as just people who happen to have a thinner stack of ideas, concepts, and abilities. I bet that you can imagine a number of things that people who in the schema would be described as living in savagery can do that you can't. The people who are prototypically placed into this box of savagery are hunter-gatherers. And I imagine that most of you would acknowledge and accept that most people living in this room, for sure, and often, by and large in our society, can neither hunt nor gather in some of the ways that living hunter-gatherers today can. So it's fairly easy to think of different cultural forms that we are unfamiliar with that live in other societies. But this is kind of the first premise of Morgan's method. And the second part of his method is to put peoples into sequence so as to understand other cultures as basically equivalent to an earlier form of quote unquote our own. And you'll notice that I have we in brackets up here. In the original text, in Ancient Society, Lewis Henry Morgan writes, quote, "The remote ancestors of the Aryan nations," that's the we, "presumptively passed through an experience similar to that of existing barbarous and savage tribes, though the experience of these nations embodies all of the information necessary to illustrate the periods of civilization, both ancient and modern." And so the method proposed is that in attempting to reconstruct a past, one can deduce that past from existing institutions and inventions and similar elements still preserved in savage and barbarous tribes. I'm going to interrupt this narrative for just a minute to deal with a question that Matthew Angelka raises in terms of how do we understand these people in their context. And this is a question about the social evolutionists of this 19th century Victorian era, and asking whether or not they were less, or at least in some importantly different way, racist than their other contemporaries. So I'll let Angelka make his case first. And this is something he does in the chapter that you've read. He writes, "One point that often gets lost in the contemporary tut-tuts aimed at these Victorians is the progressiveness of their overarching principle. To say in the 1870s that a bushman in the Kalahari and a gentleman in London had psychic unity was to challenge a logic of racism and racialism that had long been and still is powerful, that white people and not white people have different qualitative mental capacities." So what Angelka is referring to as a psychic unity is this very idea that all human beings are traversing, kind of climbing up the same ladder of civilization through these savage and barbarous states into the present. In order to try and evaluate this, I want to throw out quotes from both Lewis Henry Morgan and Edward Tyler. And we can see to what degree this intellectual progressivism is something that you see as present in their work. So just looking at these, overall monographs that were central presentations of their work and central presentations of the social evolutionary narrative, so the same books, Lewis Henry Morgan, I'm quoting here on the left, writes, "The inferiority of savage man in the mental and moral scale, undeveloped, inexperienced, and held down by his low animal appetites and passions, is still further illustrated by the present conditions of tribes of savages in a low state of development," unquote. And for Tyler, quote, "As Dr. Johnson contemptuously said when he had read about Patagonians and South Sea Islanders in Hawkesworth's Voyages, quote, 'One set of savages is like another,' unquote. How true a generalization this really is, any ethnological museum may show," unquote. So I've tried not to be unfair in picking out these two quotes. They seemed the most directly relevant to discussing what they may have meant by psychic unity. And you do get in this phrase, undeveloped, inexperienced, and held down, right? An idea of like, oh, it's fundamentally the same person deeply on the inside who is held back perhaps by their culture or their culture's quote unquote inexperience in the case of Lewis Henry Morgan. And Edward Tyler has this opportunity in quoting the sentence from another author to contrast his view about different sets of savages. But he doesn't. He kind of doubles down on it. To take one more example of a Victorian social evolutionist, here's John Lubbock, one of the founders of archaeology, writing in prehistoric times, quote, "Savages may be likened to children, and the comparison is not only correct, but also highly instructive. Many naturalists consider that the early condition of the individual indicates that of the race, that the best test of the affinities of a species are the stages through which it passes. So also it is in the case of man. The life of each individual is an epitome of the history of the race, and the gradual development of the child illustrates that of the species. Hence, the importance of the similarity between savages and children." So this is actually a really common trope in social evolutionary in the social evolutionary narrative. It's not one that comes up when people are trying to recapitulate the history of the discipline so much. But you also get it from Tyler, for example, who writes, quote, "We may, I think, apply the often repeated comparisons of savages to children as fairly to their moral as to their intellectual condition," unquote. So Engelke is writing us a story about how we might value some ideas about civilization and change, and puts forward this case about the Victorian social evolutionists. And as it turns out, there is someone who has written the book about Victorian social evolutionists and the way that they talk about people's race and change. And you can see this in Patrick Brantlinger's Dark Vanishings. He writes, with a few exceptions, Lewis Henry Morgan and Alfred Russel Wallace are perhaps the main ones. Most evolutionists treat primitive races and cultures negatively, not only as doomed by the inexorable laws of nature, but also as meriting their pending extinctions. I'll end my interruption there. Okay, so with the ideas of social evolution in their minds, anthropologists nonetheless went on this kind of empirical quest for new data to learn about what they termed as primitive cultures, right? And the idea of primitive is one that's a little different from savage. It's not saying, let me figure out everything that's wrong with you. It's a way of saying, let me see you as the first, as people who have the initial elements of what I recognize in other cultures will be a more diverse and complex whole. And so when you see that word that's going to appear in research by people who embrace the social evolutionary narrative and people who are tearing it down, it is the legacy, right, of Morgan, Tyler, and their contemporaries in understanding how to categorize peoples. And it, too, is something that's going to be discarded by the middle third of the 20th century. However, when people go out and do this research, they come back with empirical data that radically changes the prior picture of humanity as being on this single social evolutionary ladder. So if one goes, for example, to a place like the Pacific Northwest, what's now British Columbia, and interacts with a Kwakiutl, as did Franz Boas, then one is immediately in this complex position of encountering a people who are fundamentally hunter-gatherers in the sense that they don't farm and they don't have livestock. They depend directly on fishing and whaling and gathering, but who have this complex social order, who have a kinship system that would be classified, as highly complex, far above the level of savagery by Victorian anthropologists. And you have all kinds of cross-cutting stories that come out from doing empirical research. So this leads Franz Boas, among others, to question the social evolutionary narrative. And so he writes in 1920, quote, "The social evolutionary hypothesis implies that our modern Western European civilization represents the highest cultural development towards which all other more primitive types tend, and that, therefore, retrospectively, we can construct what he calls an orthogenetic, that is a naturally directed development towards our own modern civilization." So he's like, let's look at this thing. And however, when we look at it in the light of the evidence, he writes, as soon as we admit the hypothesis of a uniform evolution has to be proved before it can be accepted, the whole structure loses its foundation. Boas is only one piece of a larger story about the discrediting of the social evolutionary narrative, which involves the work of many different people. Over the first half of the 20th century, there's going to be multiple different intellectual lines of attack on this process. Nonetheless, by the mid 20th century, it's no longer going to be taken as a credible way of understanding and dividing up peoples in anthropology, whether or not one attaches pejorative labels to it. Nonetheless, this in many ways is the part of anthropology that casts the longest shadow over popular perceptions over other cultures. Victorian anthropologists created an immensely powerful and widespread meta-narrative about the human past, in which you have a series of well-ordered stages of development that lead up to the society that was writing the story. And that has been extremely convincing and also extremely orienting. It's also been something that's been taken into the ways that historians will narrate what they call prehistory, and therefore may have become one of the most influential overall narratives in how people look at the past. So as Dan Siegel writes, social evolutionary thinking remains in secular knowledge and schooling, notwithstanding the discrediting of it as a named theoretical position within disciplinary anthropology.